Welcome to this episode of Preaching the Word, a video series on preaching sponsored by the Dunk Tank and the Berman Ministry Center. My name is Dr. Stephen Reasor, and I'm a preacher and author, and I teach preaching at Berman University in Lacombe, Alberta. In this episode, we look at a sermon shape that helps us preach from the wisdom literature of the Bible. This is the poetic sermon structure. Poetry is different than narratives and epistles. It uses symbols and structures to encode meaning. And when we preach from the poetic portions of the Bible, we need to take that encoding seriously. The Bible writers chose to express meaning for a reason, and to preach a true biblical sermon, we need to let the poetic text say and do in our context what it did and said in the ancient context. That often means bringing a poetic element into the sermon. If you spent time reading the book of Psalms, or Proverbs, or Song of Solomon, you may have noticed that the Bible verses are arranged differently than in other parts of the Bible. Each verse is broken up into different lines, and they are often indented as if they are trying to communicate some kind of structure to you. That's because they are. Hebrew poetry has certain unique and easily identified shapes that it takes, ways of arranging words and ideas. English poetry often uses rhyming sounds at the end of lines to let you know that it's poetry. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder where you are. Up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky. There are other types of poetry that don't rhyme sounds, but rhyming is very common in English poetry. Hebrew poetry, on the other hand, rhymes ideas, not sounds. Let another man praise you, and not your own mouth, a stranger and not your own lips, says Proverbs 27:2. This approach to poetry allows the poet to use imagery and symbolism to compare and contrast ideas. When preaching from wisdom literature and other poetic parts of Scripture, the sermon should be shaped so that this symbolism and imagery is given meaning. Such a structure might account for the entirety of the sermon, or it could account for one or more moves of the sermon. Now, there are numerous possibilities for arranging such a sermon. In poetry, variety is the rule, not the exception. One example could be a sermon where the pastor shares a new poem that says to modern ears what the Scriptures said to ancient ears. This could be followed by a reading of the poetic text in the Bible, and then an application of both poems, one in the ancient context, one in the modern context. Sort of like the 4-page sermon, but focused on poetry instead of a problem. Let's say that I'm preaching on Psalm 31, a psalm about God's faithfulness to rescue us, even when we have made mistakes. The whole psalm is a poem. If you are a poet, you could, having exegeted and reflected on Psalm 31, you could write a poem that symbolizes to our culture the same ideas that Psalm 31 symbolized in David's day. Maybe you aren't a poet, but you know a poet. You could invite them to help you with your sermon in this way. Then you could begin your sermon with the modern poem, then share David's poem in Psalm 31, discuss what the poem meant in David's day, and then apply your new poem to the modern context. A sermon on Psalm 31 might have the following moves. A modern poem could say, "The faithful God who saves the faithful." And then the ancient poem would be the poem from Psalm 31. You'd have the poetic text of Psalm 31 there, and following that would be the ancient application. In a lawless land, David lived faithfully towards God because he trusted God's faithfulness. And finally, a modern application might be, in a world that calls wickedness good, we live faithfully toward God because we trust that God continues to be faithful in his judgment of wickedness and defense of righteousness. Like the 4-page sermon, you can arrange these moves in several ways. You could start with the ancient poem and then move to the modern poem. Or you could start with the ancient poem, look at the ancient application, before moving to the modern poem and application. However you arrange it, you will start with the poem and end with the modern application. That's it. Now, poetry might not be your thing, and this may seem like a daunting task. But when you're preaching from the poetic parts of the Bible, consider that you may need to step out of your normal, comfortable way of preaching in order to let the Bible speak to your congregation like it originally spoke to God's people when it was written. Your assignment for this episode is to choose a poetic portion of Scripture that you would like to preach on. Psalm, Proverbs, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes. And consider how you can shape a poetic sermon for the text. Write out the move statements for the 4 moves, and maybe try your hand at writing a poem that is inspired by the biblical text. When you've finished your assignment, join me for the next episode of Preaching the Word, where we will explore the last dynamic structure, preaching a metaphor. I'll see you then.